Welcome to another Dumb Things People Say to Atheists. The series where we talk about things people say to atheists that are dumb. I think you get it. Now, most of the statements we've talked about so far just either besmirch the character of atheists or in one form or another tell them to, well, shut up. But this one will be a little more straightforward, at least on the surface, because for the first time since part 1, we're going to step away from backhanded insults and instead address a common form of backhanded apologetic, which is a false equivalence that sets out to legitimize belief in God by trying to drag non-religious thinking down to its level. If you'll remember, the first episode talked about the phrase, "It takes more faith to be an atheist," which is basically saying, well, sure, we have faith, but you do too because everybody ultimately has to put blind trust in something, and your thing is even dumber than ours, so nya nya nya. They don't necessarily say the nya 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 part, but it definitely feels like it's somewhere beneath the surface. But either way, that's getting off track. What we're here to talk about today is a common retort offered up by Christians when you mention they can't see God. And that is, well, you can't see the wind, but you still believe it's there because you see its effects. Wow, mind blown. Because that definitely is the same thing. Okay, so I guess I'm supposed to start off by talking about how, even though these things are dumb, they're still understandable. But with this one, I really just don't wanna. But okay, fine. As smart-alecky as this saying is, as brazenly dumb as it is, I can get how it makes an easy, accessible, and intuitive way for everyday butt-in-the-pew Christians to casually deal with one of their fundamental intellectual insecurities, which is the fact that they believe in what, by all appearances removed from its institutional and social context, is basically a fairy tale being that they've never seen and have no justified reason to believe in. I doubt they dwell on it much, but deep down, I think most intelligent, high-functioning Christians carry some vague understanding that they're engaged in what by most realistic standards is on par with belief in Santa Claus. Many of them don't like this feeling, as I didn't when I was a Christian, but they can feel pinched between the intense social and emotional pressure to acknowledge their faith and their desire to believe basically intelligent things. So if you're the type who just casually goes about your Christian life without thinking much about philosophy or apologetics, I can see how this would work as an easy way to relieve that tension and feel a little better about believing something invisible. I believe in God and He's invisible? Sure. But everybody believes in invisible things, because you don't have to see something to have proof that it's real. So is this understandable? For some people, I guess. Depending on the person, and to whatever extent you think people should be taken to task for their flippant little ways of resolving cognitive dissonance, the fact is, a lot of people around us are going to come up with quick, oversimplified answers like this to help them deal with a lot of things. And while it's unfortunate, we won't do any good by beating them over the head about it. So like it or not, this phenomenon is part of life, and the best we can do is slowly erode away at it. Now, is it at all excusable for seasoned public figures, professional apologists, or anybody else who should have put more than a moment's thought into this and should take responsibility for the message they pass on to others? Not in the least. But one way or the other, it is destructive, and what starts as a defensive statement meant to resolve internal tension can carry aggressive undertones with potential to undermine a conversation in an unpredictable variety of ways. That's what takes this from a really basic apologetic to a bona fide dumb thing people say to atheists. Because this saying is not just defending a Christian position. It's creating an equivalence between their reasons for belief in God and your reasons for belief in wind, or electricity or whatever else they bring up. But the specific example they use is just at the surface of the conversation, because fundamentally what they're really getting at is your epistemology, your general standard of evidence. They're saying that you're no smarter than they are, even though we know that's not the issue, that you believe in things for reasons that are just as questionable, or at least as indirect, as their reasons for belief in God. And whether they say this to elevate their God belief or degrade your supposed pretense at skepticism, this could, depending on their approach, get a little accusatory. there's potential for insinuation that you're holding them to a double standard, allowing yourself license to believe invisible things while treating them as stupid for doing the same. And again, nobody should be treating anybody as stupid. But when a person is dealing with their own internal insecurities about what they believe, they can quickly get defensive when dealing with someone who draws attention to them. And there's potential for them to throw this back at you, not just as a defense of their belief, but as a snippy retort that you're no better and shouldn't be acting like you are. But does this comparison make sense? Well, no, of course not. And I can just about hear you boiling over with your own objections, because this really isn't a tricky puzzle to solve. But if you don't mind me explaining in my own words, maybe something in my phrasing will be of help to you if this gem comes your way. Because there are a lot of fallacies we understand on an intuitive level, but it helps to have really thought through them, even to the point of wording, before you're on the spot and emotions are running high with a Christian. Even on the most basic, dumb thing, you want to explain yourself well without fumbling or, even worse, saying something you'll regret to someone you care about. For perhaps the most fundamental problem with, but you can't see the wind, we need to look at the follow-up, but you can see its effects. This, of course, is meant to imply that we can all detect something and have perfectly justified reasons for believing it without directly looking at it. In fact, we rely on indirect observation for our understanding of many phenomena. So why should we not accept God as just one more such indirectly observed thing that people interact with and believe in for perfectly evidence-based reasons? When you put it this way, expecting Christians to point at God sounds as stupid as asking someone to point at the wind or electricity. And they might wonder why atheists go out of their way to hold God and God alone to this impossible standard. It can give believers a feeling that they're being picked on, or at least that skeptics are setting the bar impossibly high to justify their stubborn lack of belief. But this whole comparison crumbles when you ask one simple question. What effects of God are you talking about? By far the most common one I'm aware of, and the one Christians express to me most often, is a feeling of His presence or some other emotional connection to Him. This can feel very powerful to a believer, as it was to this former Christian.
He said that we would feel the Holy Spirit calling us to be baptized, and we had to have the courage to answer that call. And we should look inside ourselves and feel inside ourselves if the Holy Spirit was calling us to be baptized. And I remember I felt this shaking in my spine, and I knew the Holy Spirit was calling me, and I knew I had to go out there. And so when he asked a second or third time if anyone had felt that calling, I went up and I started praying, and I felt overwhelmed with I can't even remember exactly what the feelings were. I don't remember if it was joy or fear or a combination, but in any case, I was immediately speaking in tongues, and I was laying on the ground, and someone was praying for me. Actually, he'd been praying for me the whole time, and I experienced very profound emotions during this, and I remember I felt like a changed person, like I saw the world through new eyes. Everything seemed clearer, crisper. I had established this strong connection with God, and it was more meaningful than it had been before.
I often felt the same way myself, including an almost identical experience I would describe as electricity shooting down my spine when I at long last, started speaking in tongues. The feeling of euphoria when I prayed or worshipped, the sense of another presence, at times felt so much like the effects of God that I might have thought this saying made perfect sense. And while this was a hard-fought feeling for me, one I couldn't reliably conjure until my junior year in high school, I know how real it can seem. But of course this is not an unquestionable effect of God, as much as an experience that is arbitrarily interpreted as coming from Him. Looking back at my Christian past, I recognized that all I was feeling was a raised emotional state. That's it. Now, can I prove to a Christian that what I feel is not a manifestation of God? No. but the fact is that the emotional experience is all that's clearly, demonstrably there. There are many possible ways to explain where it comes from, and when we notice that these feelings typically accompany and arguably rely on meditative or religious experiences, and that these experiences produce a similar effect in people of various religious and non-religious backgrounds, we have every reason to consider God a superfluous and highly questionable explanation for them. Compare this to the effects of the wind. When I step outside, I conclude it's windy when I hear a blowing sound, feel air moving against me, and maybe see trees swaying and leaves blowing around. The signs are so obvious, tangible, and measurable that nobody would have any reasonable basis for arguing that we are not experiencing wind. Of course, a Christian could counter that not everything needs to be obvious, tangible, and measurable. And sure, maybe not everything does. But if the effects of God are not as obvious, tangible, and measurable as the effects of the wind, then all we've done is illustrate the major difference between the evidentiary standard for believing in wind and the evidentiary standard for believing in God, and shown that this is a ridiculous comparison from the start. But aside from how much more obvious and demonstrable the effects of the wind are, come on, did we need to explain that part? There's another issue here, one that really cuts to a fundamental difference between scientific and religious thinking, and that is the kind of conclusion a person draws from the effects they see. When scientifically inclined people see the effects of the wind, they take the phenomena for what it is and respond accordingly. Wind prompts different people to take a variety of actions ranging from securing loose objects to engineering buildings to studying what causes wind and learning how to measure and forecast it. Each of these activities is a direct response to what we know about the wind or the effects of the wind. In fact, our entire idea of the wind is nothing more than a description of its effects. However, this is far from the case with God and the effects of God. When the more religiously inclined see the effects of God, they don't just look at the actual phenomena and try to learn what it is. If they did that, they would just be engaging in some kind of psychological study about the effects of what happens when people meditate or listen to music, or at least in basic introspection about their experiences. But this is not what happens. Instead, they immediately take this huge pre-woven narrative of a god, its character, and an entire accompanying mythos that can never reasonably be deduced from an emotional experience, and just assume it came from that experience. If people did anything even remotely like this with their observations of wind, we'd all laugh at them. The fact is, most Christians don't want to approach the effects of God the way we approach the wind. In fact, I'd say many are terrified to introspect on their own religiously induced emotional experiences. Somewhere inside, they're aware of the possible reasons for what they feel. But in my experience, they, including former me, steer a mile wide of any troubling explanations and just tell themselves that it must be God and that whatever non-Christians feel can't be as real. Honestly, I think that deep down, that's the biggest reason some Christians don't want their kids listening to secular music. You don't need your Christian teen thinking, I felt God at church, but I also felt something very similar at a concert last weekend. Whatever could that mean? Or maybe if he has a Muslim friend who feels the same connection with Allah? Yeah, let's not even go there. Really, this whole comparison falls flat on its face, and when explored at any length, it just illustrates the difference between religious faith-based thinking and scientific evidence-based thinking. So when a Christian tells you, you can't see the wind but you can see its effects, you might politely and calmly, 1. Ask them what effects of God they're talking about. 2. Ask how they determine that these phenomena are the effects of God. 3. Suggest other more parsimonious explanation for these phenomena. 4. Explain how obvious and direct the effects of the wind are by comparison. And 5. Clarify how we study the effects of the wind and what conclusions we draw about it. For numbers 1 and 2 especially, you'll want to approach this carefully and take time to let it be a gently unfolding conversation, because this can be touchy. But hopefully, as dumb as this really dumb thing is, you can use it to plant some seeds of insight into what they believe and why. Now, there are other things people might call the effects of God. His presence is the main one I hear, but some bring up things like miracle stories or the change in people's lives after becoming Christian. These all have one thing in common, though, and that is that they all have clear natural explanations, and they are only called the effects of God because God is tacked onto them by people who want Him to be the explanation for them. This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Bullwinkle, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.